Hi everyone. Today we're going to be going through the SSSDC 2023 Round 2 Division 1 motion. And the motion for the round read, "This house regrets the trend of creating movies and TV shows which portray villains as sympathetic characters." So, for example, the Joker, Maleficent, and Cruella. So before we get into the motion proper, I think it's important to discuss a couple of things. And that first thing is the burden. So in a this house regrets debate, the debate is retrospective in nature. So arguments need to focus on what it looks like in the past. So relatively simple. Think teams should know this, but there's always a tendency because it's simply just very easy to forget this. For instance, during your 1 hour prep. So not just for this motion, but for all THR motions in general. I think it's very important to keep in mind that it's retrospective. So this ensures that your arguments do end up being within the scope of the debate, and also so that you do not have to defend things you don't actually need to. So if your opponent makes a claim about the future, you can simply point out that it just simply does not apply in this debate. So that would save you quite a lot of time, quite a lot of effort. I think the next thing we need to talk about is then characterization. So this applies for debates where they talk about trends. I think the first question you always need to ask when you see a motion about a trend is, why did the trend happen? Who pushed the trend? Why are they pushing it? So in the context of the present motion, the trend largely came about because there was a recognition of a need to have more realistic characters. Because I think at some point, film directors finally acknowledged that people are complex, people are multifaceted, and real life villains don't just wake up one day and decide to be really horrible people. So they found that the trope of the sympathetic villain made it much easier to connect to audiences because audiences are better able to relate to these types of characters, because they might be really bad people, but they're also human and they're suspect the same human fallibilities because of the things that they've gone through. So it makes them a more understandable and more intriguing character. So what does this look like? I think the motion already gives a couple of really good examples, but here are just generally a few more. In totality, these are individuals who are anti-heroes and they're made sympathetic with regards to the types of backstories that they have. So yep, couple of examples here. I thought the one of Magneto from the X-Men was particularly interesting because he was a child in a Nazi concentration camp. And when he watched the things that humans did to one another, he kind of lost faith in humanity. So when he discovered his mutant powers, he finally lashed out against everybody. So basically, these are people who otherwise would have turned out normal had it not been for the extreme hardship and the extreme oppression that they did face. So third thing, what exactly is the impact of this motion? I think this goes for not just this motion, but for a lot of media debates in general. The impact in those types of motions is generally quite iffy because it's a bit hard to say that when we see shows about a certain thing that directly, tangibly, severely impacts the way the world works, right? So for instance, using the present motion, it might be a bit hard to say that because of the trope of the sympathetic villain, that's why we now factor things like an individual's background into criminal justice and sentencing. It's a bit hard to draw the link because of how different they are. So some motions are low impact, and that is okay, but it's important to acknowledge the fact that it is actually low impact, so you don't end up trying to prove claims that sound a bit illogical. So here are some examples of the impacts of media debates. I think the first and the most obvious one is that it shapes the way in which individuals view the world. An example of this is because, for instance, the media that people consume, especially when they are young, greatly affects the way in which they grow up. So when people see particular forms of cartoon, they try to embody the protagonist. People want to feel like they can relate to their favorite movie character. People often want to see themselves within the types of franchises that they watch. All of this means is that the media we watch has a great impact, not just on the way we perceive others, but also on the way in which we perceive ourselves. I think the second impact of media debates in general is regardless of whether or not it shapes the way we actually do view the world, because presumably a lot of things go into the way we view the world. What it does, at the very least, is that it is a statement about the world and about the society we live in, and how we therefore ought to be able to perceive reality, how we ought to perceive those individuals around us. And I think that is something that is particularly applicable in the present motion because even if you might want to posit that it's hard for people to say, well, relate to these villains, right, in any case, because of the types of things that they do, I think it still makes a statement about how we ought to treat people who act the way they do because of certain backgrounds and certain oppression that they face, which leads me to the issue in this debate. So debate generally centers around the idea of, are bad outcomes and are misdeeds justifiable if they are grounded in a history of oppression? So this is a fundamental question that both sides absolutely need to answer. So proposition case. As a point of setup, I think it's important for the teams to deal with this idea first, right? So why exactly can the individual circumstances of these villains be traded off? Because presumably the first thing opposition is going to do is they're going to come up and say that, well, it is justified because self-defense, because they need to take revenge, because something really bad happened to them. It's simply easier to sympathize. So what prop needs to do from the start is to explain why we can and why we should make this trade-off. So the way to do that is simply to prove that violence in and of itself is unjustified. That's something I'll go into in the next few slides, but here's just a brief answer of why exactly I would argue, for instance, that violence is unjustified, because it's essentially the idea that no one individual, no matter what type of harm or oppression you face, can or should be the arbiter of right or wrong. And violence therefore makes someone the arbiter because the other party cannot negotiate with them. So for instance, when a villain decides to level, say, a whole building, there's nothing you can actually do to negotiate with them in their campaign of revenge. So first argument, why exactly violence in these films is unjustifiable? So I think this comes prior to any arguments about the practical impacts on, well, say, how we view the word policymaking. I think insofar as Prop is able to prove that violence in these films is unjustifiable, it gives them a significant advantage in the debate. So a couple of reasons, and the first is that violence in these films often goes beyond just self-defense, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge that it is unfortunate what happened to these individuals, and it is unfortunate that society did not protect them. And perhaps the appropriate reaction might be self-defense. Or if we want to go further, perhaps the appropriate reaction is reparations. But it's important to point out, and it's important to give, I think, a bit more characterization on this, that at most times the actions of these sympathetic villains go far beyond it, right? What it looks like is more of a bloodthirsty campaign of revenge, or involves waging war on kingdoms, cities, humanities itself, if not at least the people who wrong them and perhaps their families and a lot of other people, right? So the reason why this argument is important is because it shows that the common metric used to justify it does not specifically fit in this instance, even if we want to acknowledge that. So it's a lot easier to prove that self-defense here is unjustified rather than, say, for instance, self-defense is unjustified. So teams need to be more strategic, the types of angles they use, which they use to prove arguments. Tier 2, I think this ties back kind of to what I was saying earlier, which is that violence here is disproportionate, right? So violence is disproportionate. So this is the reason why, for instance, their campaigns go beyond self-defense, right? And it's because it is biased, and therefore this cannot be considered justice. So when we talk about ideas like justice, it usually comes with things like notions of fairness, notions of proportionality, and I think mainly that it is unbiased. But here it is clear that the villain themselves is determining what is fair based on their subjective experiences. And what this means is that they are not an objective metric in comparison to other means of holding individuals accountable, such as, say, the justice system, which is why it absolutely cannot be justified because it is disproportionate. So for instance, if to draw a parallel to criminal sentencing, right? If a sentence was so out of proportion for the types of things that the person did, say, for instance, if we had the death penalty for parking your car wrongly, right? That is something that would be considered unfair because it's disproportionate. And the same thing applies to the present circumstances. Third reason, the violence in these films necessarily does come with collateral damage. This proves why, even if they do seek to do the right thing, and even if they do seek to do it proportionally, it is inevitable that third-party harm is going to be incurred by virtue of the actions that these villains often engage in, right? Like we always see large-scale destruction. We see destruction of property, lives, they level whole cities, they use their powers to shoot lightning, right? And this always a large degree of third-party harm, even if the films don't explicitly show it and even if they don't explicitly focus on it, right? And what this means is that this is a bad thing because firstly, this is just one reason. There could presumably be other reasons, but yeah. Innocence is the ultimate standard by which we understand that people should not be exposed to harm. So this is why third-party harm in general is considered a very bad thing. This is why, for instance, rules of war say that you're not allowed to kill civilians. So for instance, most legal systems set a very high standard of proof for criminal cases because they would rather, well, one of the reasons is that they would rather a guilty person walk free than an innocent person get convicted. This is because the demand for us not to inflict harm on others is fundamentally greater than the demand on us to inflict justice upon others. Because justice, at the end of the day, I think society has decided, is simply less important than tangible harms to innocent people, because innocence is the main metric by which we understand that people ought to be protected. And the impact of this argument is that these types of films, therefore, undermine our notions of justice because it encourages us to take revenge into our own hands. So it encourages civilian violence. So maybe these films posited as encouraging vigilantism, but at the end of the day, the message they send, right, that violence can be disproportionate, that you ought to be the arbiter of violence, that the collateral damage caused by violence is okay. These are ultimately all things that still does undermine notions of justice in society because it encourages people to take revenge into their own hands. And at the end of the day, this is fundamentally a morally unjust proposition to make. So the second argument, and this relates more off to the practical impacts regarding what exactly these films do. So regardless of the principal outcomes, right, as I've already discussed earlier, I think it does a couple of things here, right? So first of all, these types of films implicitly suggest that harmful behavior is justified if individuals do have difficulties or if they are treated a certain way. So what this does is that it essentially encourages people to take things into their own hands, but maybe a step too far. So obviously, Ott will say, well, most people don't have the capacity to become supervillains. Important for prop to acknowledge this so that your arguments don't seem too out of scope. Maybe a more watered down version might be the fact that people will, for instance, justify the poor behavior that they engage in. So this encourages people to be more petty with their actions, for instance. This encourages people to be more retaliatory in the way in which they behave with other individuals. So for instance, if they think someone did not treat them well, they might think it more justified to be petty or to be hostile to them. Not going to spend too much of time on this argument. I think teams generally do know how to prove things like this. My only point of advice is when you know emotion is low impact, it is okay to acknowledge that it is low impact and just prove the impacts that you think you can actually reasonably and meaningfully prove. So the impact of this is that it generally allows individuals to shirk responsibilities, allows them to put the blame on harmful behavior, and maybe in some really extreme circumstances, it might motivate individuals to take justice into their own hands. And whether or not this is or is not a good thing, it is something that is up for debate. I think most of the time we can safely say that vigilantism in society is not always necessarily the best thing because for the reasons I stated earlier, right, and why violence is unjustified. It often goes beyond self-defense. It's often disproportionate. There are often justice systems in place that people ought to be using rather than taking the means of violence back into their own hands. So that would essentially conclude the proposition case. Okay, so now moving on to opposition. So I think for op, it might be strategic to dedicate some time as to why the media is a particularly important or particularly pervasive influence because, proposition can simply say it's just not that bad as media debates are typically low impact. So this prevents them from washing out the majority of your benefits because a proposition does give you that line of argumentation, then they can say, well, what it turns on is whether violence in this film is actually justified. And then op kind of has an issue. So you should capitalize on that, spend some time impacting this in your setup. So the same issue, these characters are people made sympathetic with regards to their backstories. Moving on to the first argument. So this is basically just the converse of the proposition case. I'm not going to spend too much of time explaining it. But the first argument would essentially be that violence is justified, right? And violence is justified because it is akin to self-defense. So you want to put in some time to explain why exactly this is akin to self-defense. And I think this is where you can use more rhetoric, more characterization about the magnitude of the struggles that these individuals face, like how they were vulnerable, how society inflicted this upon them without their consent, how they were really the victims of some of the worst things that people have done to one another. And I think using a lot of rhetoric here, not included in my slides, would have been quite helpful in making your case slightly more convincing, because it just doesn't serve to have a one-liner that says violence is justified because it's akin to self-defense. So I think teams do need to know where they have good angles, need to use rhetoric to kind of pump up the factor of how convincing your argument is necessarily going to be. So didn't include that here, but it's something that should be done. Yeah, so violence is unjust because there are typically other systems. Yeah, so basically what Prop says, right, that violence is unjust because there are other systems. Like we do have the justice system, we do have the police system. But I think something that is characteristic of these films is that, for instance, like the police are corrupt, the government is corrupt, the law isn't on the side of innocent individuals. So what this means is that when violence is unjust, people ought to take back the means of violence into their own hands. And this is the common justification for vigilantism in the status quo. Violence in and of itself is not wrong. And I think this is the angle that opposition needs to take. It's not that violence is wrong, but it's just that society is structured such that the state has a monopoly of violence in status quo. So insofar as the state having a monopoly of violence is a bad thing, for instance, because they're not using it for justice, or they're simply not using it at all, then there is no reason for the state to have a monopoly of violence anymore. And it is now justified for these individuals to take it back into their own hands, not just for themselves, but also often for the other people that they seek to protect. So this is how OP can counter the self-defense angle. There are a couple of other ways to do that. I just thought this was the most important one. I think teams were generally able to pick up on the others. This would also be a point of response to the, I think, the really common idea of self-defense. So the second argument would therefore be about the types of impacts that this debate has had upon society and upon individuals. And I think this is where OP can afford to go all out on it gives us a means by which we ought to see the world, or it changes the way in which we perceive certain individuals. So to draw a parallel to, say, groups that are disproportionately affected by structural oppression or harms in status quo. Yep, so to draw a parallel to African-American crime, just to get you to think, right, it's the same question stands. Is it valid to say that we should blame these people for it? Because more often than not, the way they act, some of them, is a result of the circumstances that they have faced. So is it therefore still really fair to blame, for instance, oppressed groups for their action? So the impact of these films that opposition needs to frame it as is the question of how exactly we determine responsibility in society with regards to things that people do. Yeah, so the first impact, this ties back into the general impacts I gave you on media debates earlier, which is that this affects how we as a society understand such individuals. So individuals who commit crime because of oppression that they have faced. Obviously, the degree of oppression isn't going to be the same. It's a leap to say that everyone who commits crime has done so because they were victims of Nazism. Like, no, there's other degrees of oppression that people face. And yes, it might be to a lesser extent, but overall, it still does tie into how some people's life necessarily turn out. So the impact that OP can frame it as is that it makes people more understanding, because now we at least have that idea in the back of our heads that people don't just wake up one day and decide to be bad. People wake up one day and do things that we consider bad because of circumstances that they face, i.e. there's always a reason behind the crime, a reason why people turned out that way. And the reason why this is a good thing is that we don't just simply blame these individuals as being perpetrators of crime for no apparent given reason, right? So what this does is that it, at the end of the day, I think you should be able to tie it to how it creates a culture of empathy, because we now better understand that people do the things that they do and that they're more likely to want to do something about these oppression, because we understand that it's something that is out of people's control and therefore that they act a certain way. So you could tie this into how over the years, I think society at large has become more understanding of the structural oppression that certain minorities face, for instance, and why this might lead to disproportionately higher rates of crime as compared to, like, say, more in the past where we decided that, you know, people committed crimes because they were bad, or if you were a certain ethnicity, you're simply more likely to commit a crime. I think what these films does is that they put it at the back of our minds that there are reasons why people commit crimes, and this relates to the worst crimes of all. So obviously with lesser degrees of crime, there's still a reason why people did it. We still ought to put in some effort to understand why. At the very least, at the end of the day, we don't just characterize everybody who does bad things as bad people. We understand that people are more complex and people are more multifaceted than that. So that creates a culture of empathy at the end of the day. Yeah, so here are some other ways you could tie this impact back. Again, I don't think this list is exhaustive. This is just a couple of things I came up with. So this looks like having had more discourse into the motives of why exactly people commit crime. Like now it will be common to say that, oh yes, certain groups are more likely to commit crime because they have faced certain structural issues in society. So things like poverty, things like growing up in bad neighborhoods. So there are a lot of reasons why people commit crime, and we're more ready to acknowledge those reasons now. So yeah, that ties into the next point, right? It looks like concessions to that. People commit crimes for various reasons, basically, that are out of their control. And what this means is that we're now more sympathetic and understanding about things like the disproportionate incarceration of certain individuals, because we pin it on oppression that they have faced rather than inherent evil. And I think this is fundamentally a good thing, because unlike, say, the villains in movies, the real life people that we perceive differently because of this are often people who don't inflict violence in an unjustified manner. They're not people who go on bloodthirsty campaigns of revenge. They're often not people who would seek to flatten an entire building. Simply doesn't happen that much. So what this means is that the benefit is necessarily a good thing, because it helps us understand people who do need to be understood better. So this is a way in which you can get tangible impacts out of just saying that, well, media changes the way we shape the world. So here are some examples of how exactly you can prove that. I think this is a more feasible goal for opposition to have, rather than trying to say this directly impacts how we make the law. Like, it might not impact how we make the law, because a lot of things go into how we make the law. But at the end of the day, I think it is sufficiently easy for op to prove that it at least changes the way we see these people, and it makes us think that they're not just entirely bad, but also maybe victims of their circumstances. Yeah. So impact number 2, back to what I said earlier, right? At the end of the day, media and films are still about making a statement. So even if you do not necessarily buy that the trope of the sympathetic villain is the reason why people are a lot more, well, say, sympathetic towards individuals who commit these types of crimes nowadays. But at the end of the day, media and films are still about making a statement. So what this means is that as a society, the way we now conceptualize responsibility is through the background of the person and not just the act in isolation. Or at the very least, this is what we should be doing, and it puts that idea out there for people to be able to make use of, right? So, and this is important because it sets a standard, or at the very least, an ideal of how we should treat such people, that we should treat people as complex, that we should not just treat people as bad because of one bad thing that they did. And I think the idea of setting this standard, regardless of the types of practical outcomes, is fundamentally a good thing, because at least this idea is out there. It's something that people can tap into. It's something that we do to a certain and to a greater degree acknowledge after the release of these films, because it sparks people to be discussing about it, whatnot. So even if you don't buy that it actually changes how people perceive similar individuals in status quo, at the very least, it makes a statement about how we should conceptualize responsibility, and making a statement can actually be quite a powerful thing. So that concludes the motion review for SSSDC round 2. If you have any questions, you have any arguments you did not know how to respond to, if maybe you want to know how to have some greater degree of characterization regarding these types of speeches, yeah, just drop them in the comment section and I will reply you at some point.